My name is Chuck Cappatto. I'm a veteran, and I am democracy. When Kenny asked me a while back to say a few words of what democracy means to me as a veteran, I put a lot of thought into it. And I think it's important that you learn a little bit about me before I get into my story and the journey I've led. It all happened back in spring of 1965. I sent a letter off to the university I was attending and said I needed some time off between my junior and senior year. I didn't even know what I wanted to do when I grow up, so I needed some time. They sent a letter back and said, that's fine, we'll see you around the first of the year. Shortly after that, I received another letter from the Selective Service Department, the draft board. Seems they had other plans for me. Now, I didn't want my life inconvenienced by some war in Southeast Asia I knew little about, didn't even know where it was at. But I come from a long line of veterans, so I didn't really have a choice. And a little over a year later, I found myself in that very land. And it was magical in a lot of ways, beautiful in its simplicity, hard to believe that it's been ravaged by war for decades. But I was fortunate. A year and a half later, I returned back to the States. But when I returned back, I came back to an ungrateful nation, one that held me accountable for what was going on there, as if it was my fault. I just did what the government asked me to do, fundamentally made me do. So when I returned to this ungrateful nation, it didn't seem right. I didn't really understand what was taking place. A lot of military members and veterans alike became very disenchanted with the government. It's disenchanted with their politicians. Nobody stood up, welcomed us home, thanked us for what we did over there. It was our fault. So I didn't understand this. And probably about 6 months later, when I was discharged from the Marine Corps, I had to find out more about it. So I moved to Washington, D.C. I got a job with a congressman from the district I was from in the Midwest. He told me two things. He said, one, I don't work for the government, nor do you. We work for our constituents back in the district. The second thing he said was, if I sponsor legislation or I vote on legislation, it has to be good for my district, good for my constituents, and it has to be good for the nation. So now I started to feel a little more comfortable with what it was all about. But then I still had more to learn, so I reflected back on what Abraham Lincoln said on a hillside in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, so long ago. He spoke of a government for the people, of the people, by the people. Became more clear to me then. Then I thought about what John F. Kennedy said at his inaugural address, almost 100 years later. Ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Things became more clear now. And I realized that democracy was us. It was me. It was all of us. We needed to take ownership for democracy. But what is democracy? It's got no shape. It's got no color, no taste, no smell. So I had to put a lot of thought into that, and I realized that democracy is not only the soul of our nation, it's wrapped in this pioneer spirit that has personified it for decades, handed down to us. Now, some people think democracy is a work in progress. I think that's arrogant bullshit, if I can say that word. Too many people have worked too hard over too long a period of time. Too many people have gave everything for democracy. So it's not permeable. It's something that we inherited, and it's our responsibility to perpetuate it for future generations to come. Now, in my opinion, it's not going to change on my watch, and it should not change on yours either. So it's up to us to take ownership for democracy. Now, how do we do that? Certainly we vote. That's one way of doing it. But I think it takes more effort than that. I think what we need to do is to interact with our legislators. Remember, they're our employees. They work for us. We are the people. Our taxes put a roof over their head, food on their table, clothes on their children. So they damn well better be responsible to us. Now, I'm a firm believer that you need to give them instructions. Just because somebody's clever enough to get themselves elected doesn't necessarily mean they know the job or they know anything about the job. If it wasn't for staff, I think most of them would probably embarrass themselves more than invigorate us. So I believe that you need to give them instructions. You need to, so you can send them an email or send them a text, but to me that doesn't carry the same weight as a letter does. When you take the time out of your day to sit down and write a letter, there's a certain feeling that that letter should be answered, and they damn well should answer it. They're accountable to us. And in that letter, you can talk about things like if you're concerned about age limits or term limits, you can mention that. If you don't understand how somebody can take a job for a good salary and a few years later end up with many more $1 million than they ever thought they'd have, ask that question. Not just on the federal level or the state level or even the local level. If you're like me and you are amazed how easy it is for local legislators to give themselves a pay increase, but they can't patch a pothole, ask them about that. And ask them, and you should expect that letter to be answered. They've got staff, they've got people that can do that for you. And that's what democracy is all about, taking ownership of it, instructing your legislators to do that. And if we don't do that, you can rest assured that they will take their marching orders or their instructions from large campaign contributors, special interest groups, and lobbyists. And if that happens, we will end up with the best legislators that money can buy, and that will do our country nor us any good at all. Now, it's been almost 60 years since I returned back from Vietnam. And over that 60 years, the names and faces of my friends and brothers that I returned home with have slowly faded away. But the names and faces of my friends and brothers that were left behind will be indelibly etched into my memory forever, and that's what democracy means for me. And thank you for paying attention. Thank you, Kenny, for what you do, okay?